And also we'll have a summary for this meeting that we'll send out later. The woman, Jen, who writes the summaries is on the Colorado Trail, so she didn't get to it. So we when we get that back from her, we'll send it out to you all and then we'll approve it at the next meeting. But again, those are important because that's what kind of feeds the reports. So appreciate y'all kind of looking through that when we have the opportunity. We hope to spend most of our time today with you all talking and not us talking. So I'm gonna kind of catch us up to where we are today. We're gonna be in breakout groups, focusing on really three key. I don't want to call them they're recommendation buckets. And really what we want you all to do is get in and start working with us on what needs to be in there, what the challenges are, et cetera. So this should not be new information to you all. These topics here, they're based on the conversations that we've had all leading up into today. I want to name a couple of tension points, which is at the last meeting, and this is all very understandable and this is all very expected, which is when we have a group like this, we've got to move things forward. We have a limited time and we've got to make sure that we get to all of our directives. I want to say that the purpose of the report, so you all are not having to write the report. We and the CPO team have to write the report about this process, right? So we are honing in on these buckets. We also recognize that there's a lot of conversation around these buckets of why or why not these are the perfect things that we have honed in on. This isn't a consensus-based group. We don't have bylaws that make it where you have to, we have to have a majority, et cetera, to move forward. But we feel pretty confident that the buckets that we are moving forward are the buckets that are reflected in this group as to where you all want to go. Any sort of concerns or challenges within those buckets, we will capture as a part of the report. So I just want to name that is part of that process, that we're not just going to like say, okay, here's what it is. And there was no questions. Wow. Can you believe it? All these people were aligned. So I just want to name that as part of this process. Doris, anything that you would add from kind of your perspective also with groups like this?
Yeah, I think just as a reminder, right now we are focused on these intervention buckets.
Yep.
And we will get to the prevention piece. We have that mapped out to begin those conversations yet later this year. But we're focused right now on these three buckets of potential interventions when kids do run away.
Yep. So point is Kevin, you're my guy who's always like, when are we going to get to the prevention? Right. So we're getting to the wrap up of this intervention piece so that we can then pivot, like Doris is saying. So that's kind of, is that good? Is that what you were saying?
Of course.
Okay, cool. And then the next meeting we'll really talk about, so we've got this interim report due, right? So then we'll really be bringing it all together to get you all's reactions around kind of where we're landing before we make that big pivot. Okay, so all that to say, those buckets, as a reminder, that we're gonna then break out into groups, and you can self-select into those groups. Now, if no one self-selects into my group or someone's group, I might pop into another group and be like, can a couple of you come over? Because we do want to make sure that we at least have 3 folks in each group so that we can have a conversation around these. And then we're really going to spend the bulk of the time and you're going to each have a facilitator in that group and a note taker. So typically we send you all in and we let you kind of like work things out, but we're going to be in there helping to facilitate the conversation and taking the notes so that you all can really just start to generate the thinking. And again, this is what's going to be reflected in the report piece. And then at the end, as you've had a chance to really like both in your group, but also then come back and do a large group reflection, hear from the other groups, we'll have a chance to take a vote that we're good to move forward. The reason we're taking a vote, again, it's not because of a bylaw, piece. It's just more like, do you all generally agree that you understand that these buckets are the ones that we captured and that you're ready for us to move forward. So we do just want to have that as part of the process that we can reference. Any questions from y'all? Sergeant Cotter, you got a question? I'm just looking at you. I'm picking on somebody. Becky, question? Renee, anybody? Okay, cool.
Trace, before
Or
we
yeah.
do that, you might have
Yeah.
been getting ready to say this. But the other thing that we wanted to just make sure is a note that we're putting a pin on the part of the conversation that involves additional resources, financial resources, and sort of like who's going to pay for this. And we know that there would need to be some resources allocated, likely for each of these interventions. And so we recognize that. We know that that's going to be a necessary part, but we're not going to dive into that piece or use that as a potential barrier for talking about if we were to stand up any of these interventions, what would it look like and what would be some of the potential gaps and challenges?
Yeah, Doris, I appreciate you making that point. That's the underpinning here. We know that in order to do these things, it's not like they just magically happen or all of a sudden we get a volunteer unit. It's that there needs to be money allocated. So appreciate you bringing that in. And that will be reflected in the report as just a conversation that has continually come up from each of you of concerns and challenges of what would this look like in a less resourced area of the state? What would this look like with competing priorities in an urban area? Those sorts of things. So that'll be its own section and we'll kind of highlight all the points that you all have made along the way. All right, I'm putting the 3 buckets in the chat. So absconder unit, the first rule of the absconder unit, as Beth says, is it's probably not going to be called an absconder unit based on, but for the purposes of this conversation and getting into the groups, we're calling it an absconder unit. So that group can kind of flesh out what does that actually look like. The second is a standardized policy response manual. Again, is it a manual? Not quite sure, but again, you all have talked about the importance of standardizing responses through policy and what that would look like and the challenges of something like that too. So again, we're talking about opportunities here and the things that we see, and we're also talking about the gaps. We know that it might be a challenge to have the same policy response in different areas. So is that policy response differentiated? Right? So those are all the things that you all work through. And then the third one is the intermediate placements when kids are recovered. So this was a big conversation with you all is what happens when the kid doesn't want to go back to the placement? What happens with the challenge of, oh, their bed is gone? What happens with the challenge of, we know if this kid goes back, they're just going to run again? What are the options there? And what do we really want to, what do we want to see happen? Those are the 3, again, that we're honing in on here. And lots of things fall underneath each of these, and we will capture those as you all bring those pieces up. Any questions before I let us break off into these groups? I'm going to be, I'll also just say, I'm going to be in the intermediate placements group. Doris will be in the standardized policy response, and Beth will be leading the absconder unit, the artist formerly known as the absconder unit group. Any questions there? Is everyone's microphone just turned off, or are you just all, I'm doing such an amazing job that nobody has questions today?
You're doing such an amazing job.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate that.
I was wondering if you shouldn't have named who was going to be facilitating which group, if that influences which group people want to go to.
No way.
I was like, because my feelings will be hurt if nobody joins my meeting.
I'm like, yeah, no offense, but everybody come. I'll what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring it up where you get to manually choose. And if everybody goes into one again, I might just be like, all right, Lynette, you're over here. So but we want folks ideally to be able to go into the group that is of most interest to them. Okay, so let's see, it is 8:17. We have an hour. I don't know that we're gonna need an hour. Beth and Doris and Alexis and Michael and Jordan, all my note takers and my facilitators, probably what I'll do is once my group is going, I'll pop around at around 9 and just see how are your groups doing? Do we need more time? Because I want a good enough time to come back and for you all to hear from the other groups. So yeah, so that's most likely what's going to happen. Okay. You should be able to, I'm going to open all the rooms now. You should be able to self-select into which room. If you can't, just wait a minute. And then once everybody else goes, I will help you get to where you need to go. All right. So I'm going to open all the rooms.
Trace, can I ask a question? Just
yeah.
When you show us it, will it remind us what the topic is for each two, or do?
Yes, you should see that. So go down to breakout rooms. You might have to click breakout rooms on the bottom and you'll see the 3.
Yeah, and I think we lost some of our group members.
Are there any members of the public on here, by the way? That would, I'm not seeing anybody. Am I missing anybody?
I think we have couple.
Do we? Okay. If anybody is wanting to make public comment at the end to the task force, can you just drop me a note so that I can reserve enough time for public comment? So I just wanted to make a note of that. All right. So it's 9:20. You know, we break at 10, so I don't think we need a break right now. Let's just power through. Let's do well, actually, do folks need a minute, or is everybody okay? Doris went to the bathroom, so is everybody okay to keep going? All right, cool. So what I'm going to say is let's give 10 minutes to each group right now. We'll do a quick kind of overview of what the group talked about. And then I would love for folks that were in other groups to then, you know, ask clarifying questions, or if you had a point that you want to make sure was reflected in those pieces as well to speak up. So let's start. Doris, why don't we start with your group? I'm not sure if you've tapped someone to share out, but let's start with your group.
We did not tap anyone to share out, but I will say that we did have one person who already had generated a lot of ideas. And so I would ask Brian, if you want to sort of give the high level, and then I can cover anything that isn't top of mind.
Sure. Yeah. And definitely add in if I forget anything.
And remind us which group you were too.
Standardized policy.
Okay.
So we talked about a couple pieces with the standardized policy. There's a lot of complexity around how to respond. At the beginning of the task force meetings, you know, months ago, we talked about how maybe a uniformed response, maybe a great big response isn't appropriate in every instance. And so rather than try to nitpick into the details of what each entity or each person would try to do to create a standardized response, there was a lot of focus on notifications and making sure that the standardized response would be to notify specific involved groups. So the groups that we talked about, law enforcement, because first of all, there's a state law that kind of drives a lot of that already, but standardizing that so that whatever provider has care and control of the child has to make notifications to law enforcement within a time frame. We kind of talked about 30 minutes, but they have to notify law enforcement because that triggers some real, it triggers some laws that require activation on National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, our NCIC group. It allows us to start to connect a child who's having a crisis out there to services, because that's who we call as cops when there's something that's happening out on the street. So that notification first. It doesn't prescribe what the cops are going to do. Like every jurisdiction may be a little bit different. Cops may take phone reports. They may send 10 officers. The scenario itself will drive the actual response, but there's this minimal response, which is the notification. Also, the County Department of Human Services, because if they're involved with the family already, not every kid is involved with the Department of Human Services who is in these facilities, but if they are involved, then a notification would have to go to the Department of Human Services. That notification, we kind of wanted to take one extra step, saying that county couldn't just throw this into their filtering process. It had to be acted on timely. So the hotline intake person should take that, and it must go to a supervisor or an administrator or even just a caseworker, but it had to go to somebody who could then decide how the department was gonna respond to that. If it needed to be exigent, that person would be responsible for making that decision. They would make that call, but it had to go to them. It couldn't just go into the red team process. It couldn't just be a sticky note on somebody's desk for Monday. It had to be an immediate notification that this child had run, and it wouldn't need to meet criteria for abuse or neglect, and it wouldn't need to meet assignment criteria. It would be a notification so that the Department of Human Services could make a decision about how they were going to react. We felt that the parent or guardian, if the parent or guardian still has, legal guardianship of the child, then they should be notified. And then finally, Finally, would be the agency, the institution where the child was at. Their administration or a designated contact person would receive immediate response there too. So that way, all the people that kind of know this kid could start to evaluate how will they respond? Will we escalate it? And then the response guide could potentially start to give out factors that could help people make the decision to escalate it. But we start at that bare minimum. These are the people that shall know in every circumstance. And then how that response looks might be different depending on the kid, depending on the county, depending on a lot of factors. We talked about, oh gosh, now I'm brain farting a little bit. Doris, can you help me?
Yeah, the decision tree. So having a process for kind of mapping out what the steps would be once, you know, notification has been made, what are the factors of the young person that might necessitate a particular response. Again, not deciding who the responder would necessarily be, because there's lots of variation across the state in terms of the county. So we didn't get into who's going to respond, but having some way of determining what the appropriate response level or risk level for the child might be. And also having, which ties back to prior conversations that we've had, some standardized assessment tool that helps to inform what are the risk levels for this particular young person. And then we also talked about MOUs, and Brian, I'm sure you can talk more detail about this, but there's a requirement that county DHS enter into MOUs with law enforcement. There's not the requirement that goes the other way, where law enforcement is required to enter into an MOU with DHS. So setting that requirement to go the other way. And then we also talked about potentially having MOUs with some additional local partners that memorialize this collaborative, multidisciplinary approach to intervening and meeting the needs of young people who run away, and I think also preventing runaways. And then the last thing that we talked about was and we didn't get really concrete in this, but potentially looking at mobile crisis and either modeling an approach off of mobile crisis, or even leveraging some of the mobile crisis resources when they're not responding to a particular crisis, to be used in some way in intervening when a young person runs away. Anything I missed?
The only thing I would add is I think the existing MOU requirements, even for the human services to law enforcement piece, I think we need to be specific that it should address children running from placements. And I say placements in this case because it would be human services, and that's where the children would be, is in a placement. So I think it needs to be specific to that, because human services may have success getting agreements with law enforcement generally, but it's mostly around abuse and neglect of kids or protective custody. But so we need to be a little more specific that in this context we're talking about runaways. We're missing.
Thank you for that, Brian. Any others?
A robust discussion, no doubt.
Yeah, we had a fantastic discussion.
Yeah.
We do. Team number one.
Yeah, right. Jeez. All right. If y'all left something out, we've captured it, I think, in your group, so we'll be okay. But anything, any questions or comments from folks from other groups listening to these folks? Would love a comment if you don't have a question, like, does that resonate? Are you like, yeah, nailed it? Or, ooh, you guys are off. Wow. Brandon, any comments from you? Thoughts?
Man, I was part of that group, so.
Oh, that's right. Dang it.
Yeah, so, but it was a good discussion. I thought they were all reasonable, steps that could be taken.
I love that.
So, and I'm all for increased communication, because I think that's a large part of this problem. So.
Well, when a provider says that sounds reasonable, I think that's a win, folks. Not often do we hear that. Love it. Thanks, Brandon. Sorry to pick on you. All right, next group. Beth, I'll kick it to your group. Not sure if you've tagged someone, but yeah, want to hear
We
what.
didn't, so I can summarize, but please, you guys jump in if I'm leaving anything out. So we certainly had, we tried to leave the financial part out of it. That was obviously just like little side pieces that's obviously kind of the overhang as to where does this come from and how much, right? And then obviously deciding like what at the state level can be implemented. And we talked about regional versus county. I think we settled on that like it needs to be at the county level, but recognizing with like smaller rural areas that there would need to be some partnerships among the counties to kind of cover that, recognizing that you're going to have larger counties that are going to have larger resources to be able to respond. A big focus we talked about, and we didn't really break it down, just recognizing that this needs to be addressed, is like key training amongst the unit as to who's responding. And then the key there being like an individualized response. And we also touched on communication is huge, and that's where this unit can kind of facilitate to ensure that communication is flowing amongst all the service providers, family. We also talked about, and I think that's where I did want to comment, like we didn't talk about MOU, but I think that would be huge with this as well. And then we kind of, one of the barriers we hit is to like defining like what response, knowing that in a perfect world, if we had the same equal response for any youth who went missing, but that's not necessarily feasible. And then breaking down kind of a tier, what does that look like? We talked about similar to your guys' group, an assessment tool that would be screening for risk of running. And then the key for it to, again, be this multidisciplinary approach to where you're going in trauma informed, and you have, by doing some screenings and that information sharing piece, ideally you have the service provider who's already working with that youth, but recognizing that that might not be realistic in every circumstance, but at least they're armed with the information to best engage with that youth. And then recognizing, depending, once you engage with that youth and you're meeting basic needs, that you're partnering with, again, that multidisciplinary approach of like, whether it's a mental health professional that can respond, streamlining it to a detective if there's a disclosure of a crime. Trying to look at our other notes. Yeah. Is there anything I'm missing, guys? I just kind of ran through that fast.
I mean, one thing I would add, that was a great summary, but that, I think a big part of this would be figuring out how to get different jurisdictions to accept this buy-in and, and to vote whatever was needed to make this happen. So like the one piece is the what needs to happen. And then the other piece would need to be a lot of strategy around how do you get this to happen in a state like Colorado?
Questions or comments from other groups for this group? Is this track with what you all were? I know we've been a part of these conversations as a larger group before we broke off into these smaller groups. So does that conversation and thinking track with what you all had been thinking and conversing about as it relates to did we come up with a different name, Beth?
I think Lynette had put it in the chat right before we had broke off, and it was
Recovery
like recovery response unit or something to that effect. Yeah.
RU.
We didn't want to get focused, bogged down by a name.
Actually, one other thing, I think important thing that we talked about is decisions around when there would be more forceful action taken and when it would not be, knowing that many kids aren't going to automatically say, okay, sure, I'll go with you. And that's a really crucial thing to parse out and figure out what criteria might be and what that might look like.
So it sounds like in this recommendation, you're really honing in on like the unique components that would need to be present for this to be effective, and also like a safe response to that child. So like a differentiated approach, a known entity to the child, those sorts of things. So that's kind of the elements that you were creating for this recommendation. Is that kind of right, Beth? Like that's kind of what, okay, cool. So again, when you all have the opportunity at the next meeting, in the next 2 meetings, to respond to the report, and kind of how we've captured that, and also in those summaries, just making sure that we've captured those unique components you want to see reflected in there. Okay, well, let's move on to the third and the final and the best group, Doris, which is the group I had the opportunity to chat with. Go ahead, Becky.
Thanks, Trace. It was a great group, and thanks again to Jordan for taking notes. Our group is intermediate placements when kids are recovered, and the big idea, I think, takeaway that we came out with is that this is a really big gap in our continuum of care currently. We lack the resources right now that we need to fill this hole. So we talked about what we used to have in Colorado, pre-family first, a lot of things. We used to have receiving homes. Lynette from Mesa County was talking about that. And those went away after the settlement agreement because it was seen as another level of care that wasn't needed. But the idea of the receiving home was that the kiddo could stay there for up to 2 weeks or something like that until they were able to get to their other placement that they needed. We also had on the West Slope an acute treatment unit, ATU, at Hilltop, and that's gone now too. So the things we do have are, we have shelters currently. We have like the Family Resource Pavilion with Shiloh, and we have a few other programs here and there that are shelter-like. But again, this is a big lap and sort of gap in our continuum. We talked about how we have the 2 parents of youth who have run away on this task force were in this group. So it was very interesting to hear their feedback. Elizabeth mentioned that they had in-home services for Timothy from Tennyson Center for quite a while, and it actually really helped stabilize Timmy and all that. Kevin talked about how that wouldn't have been the same for Joey, his son. And so we basically took away from that conversation that this really needs to be, we need enough tools in the toolbox so that we can individualize the plan for what the kid needs for the circumstances the kid is in. So we need a big toolbox, basically. And then finally, we kind of boiled it down to money. We do have providers in the state right now who might have the bandwidth to build something like this or rebuild. We have squirrely things going on with our licensing types. So we can't have, a couple of kinds of licenses on a certain piece of land in a certain distance from each other. We have squirrely things like that we need to work through, but it's workable. And so big picture is we lack this piece of the continuum and we need it. Money would really help. So we'd have to figure out how to incentivize providers to make it worth their while to build this level of care. But group, what else did I miss anything there? Maybe not. So anyway,
I was on mute. I was going to say, real quick before we come to you, I picked on Dennis. I said, Dennis, I love hearing you talk so much when I get him in a small group. So Dennis, I'm curious if you could kind of fill in from your perspective, the kind of nuances of that conversation and what came to light.
Sure. So we kind of got to the place where we identified the gap if we want an intermediate placement for children and youth that run. So the gap is those placements don't exist, right? So well, they do. One does, and that one's always fully utilized. So given that one is fully utilized, it shows that there's a need for that type of programming. Also, there were some county folks in our group that talked about like when kids run from a facility and they lose their bed at the other facility, or they're refusing to go back to that facility and say they're just going to immediately run again. We need a different option for those children and youth. So So we landed on the idea of like really thinking about like a family resource pavilion program that could also have the component that Savio does in a different way though. Like Savio does an assessment component, but could the assessment component for this type of programming really be geared towards runaways and what runaways need and what services they need, and what the family needs, that kind of thing, and also try to figure out where the next best place is for this child or youth. So that's kind of where we landed on. We don't think we necessarily need a work group to figure out what this looks like. We think there's models in place. So if it's a recommendation out of this committee, that the department run an RFP and figure out like to run this kind of programming, then that's, I guess, the next steps, right? We would have to figure out the funding component of it. This type of placement wouldn't be a 4E eligible placement.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that on the funding piece, or sorry, on the implementation piece, that the thing we talked about is like, this would most likely be a pilot program with kind of a geographic cover of like, you know, rural and urban, because those would be two different unique challenges in implementation. And so putting out an RFP to kind of do that in a rural spot and a more urban spot. So anything else from our group? And I see Dave, go ahead. If you have I don't know if you had a question for this group.
No, I was just going to say, back in 2022, there was a House Bill 1056 that was around licensed temporary shelter care. And that is something that we could, honestly, you could totally piggyback on. I mean, it's really what we're looking for here is some type of shelter care. And this was already put into place for 5 nights. But the big piece here, the funding aspect, they didn't put in nearly the amount of money that is needed to develop these shelter care beds across the state. I mean, I think initially they put in just under $132,000, and it probably should have been well into the millions of dollars to cover something like that. And I just think this is something, there's already something there. They're seeing a need for this type of placement. It just needs to truly get funded enough to develop it, and then it could get utilized in a couple different ways for runaways and for kids to not go into detention.
Yeah, you all are really just underscoring the funding piece of this report. You know, we and the unique challenges that we need to make sure that we point to in that. So I just appreciate that you all are kind of pushing on that piece, that it's not just an easy statement of like, give us more money, but it's the how, it's the at what level, it's for the what. So we're gonna have to really find a way to kind of weave that all together. Go ahead, Becky.
Thank you, Trace. David just brought up a really good point that I want to put a finer point on, and that is child welfare involved kids and detention kids and kids not involved in the system. So we have runaway issues with all of those levels, but we need to differentiate our response to them. And so I just want to be clear that we don't leave any of those out.
Yeah, can you say, and you're talking about, as we're talking about each of these different kind of recommendations that we're noting, that there are just differentiated needs and responses based on the individual child, but also at a high level based on kind of like who they are and what system they are not involved in. Is that what you're saying?
Perfect. Yep, that's perfect, Trace.
Go ahead, Jenna.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick question about funding. I know we're not focusing on that, but did I hear correctly, $40 would not be available for like receiving homes? Because if we could look at them as a prevention, because it's a community setting versus residential. So I didn't know if there was any sort of loophole.
No, receiving homes would be a 4E eligible placement because that looks more like a foster home.
Oh, okay. So they would.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I think his comment was that currently the systems that are, yeah. I heard that too, but yeah. So those would, the ones that we were talking about would be eligible. Yep. Other questions or comments, or go ahead. Are there questions or comments first?
I have a quick comment. Any kind of intermediate play, I didn't say this in the group, and maybe I should have. Any kind of intermediate placement, I mean, typically those are, entirely unlocked facilities. And unfortunately, my experience with that type of a facility directly is in Arizona, where kids constantly came and went as they pleased, and the staff couldn't stop them. And a lot of these kids that run away are going to run away from that facility as well. So that's something that we really didn't struggle with, because there's a percentage of kids that are going to run from any facility or any placement. And so, that's something that needs to be looked at even in the intermediate facility. It just can't be an unlocked facility. I saw what happened in Arizona. So
Yeah, and Kevin, you're right on that, of like not having dived into that, but I think that I would put that in the prevention conversation, with these kinds of, like, we will revisit these pieces too in prevention, right? So like if this is a recommendation, then also like what does prevention look like at that, like in this situation at that place too, right? So prevention would be kind of like a wraparound piece, not just like,
that makes sense.
yeah. So I appreciate you pointing that out, and we'll make sure to make a note of that. Okay. Well, I think it sounds like we had 3 really deep, like robust discussions. I love when we're able to get into our workout groups, because you all are the experts in this. And so it all comes to the surface. We have a task before us, Jordan, Doris, Alexis, Michael, to make sense of all of these brilliant ideas in a way that is digestible and actionable. So I'm really looking forward to moving these things forward and continuing conversations. Doris, do you have anything else from we need to, for purposes of the report, we need to take a vote on these 3 buckets, just that we're moving forward with these 3. But anything that I'm missing that we had discussed as far as to surface with the group?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Jordan, I'm going to call you out. Jordan's always off camera, but Jordan is the brains behind here. Jordan keeps me in line, me and Doris in line. Jordan, can you talk a little bit about moving forward with the report? I know we had talked about that, but you're I would love to give you an opportunity. And Jordan was out all of July and studying for the bar, and looks somewhat like she's back to sanity. So but if you haven't had a chance to chat with Jordan, I think most of you know her. She's brilliant in the brains. So go ahead, Jordan, talk to us a little bit about the report and how folks can anticipate.
Thank you.
what they're
I'm
gonna
back
see.
to forming full sentences again, so that's good. So as you all know, we have 2 reports we have to file and publish for this task force. Our interim report is due October 1st. So the goal really is during our next meeting to potentially bring back some loose language that we can discuss. But the reason we want to take a vote here is, as Trace said, we don't have bylaws. We're not seeking consensus. We recognize it's a big group, and consensus really isn't the point here. It's the conversation, it's the bringing forward of the ideas. However, I do think it's important that we pull a vote so that anyone on this call who is in disagreement with moving forward with these, has standing concerns with moving forward with these 3 buckets of recommendations, I can note that in the report. It's really an open book. I want everyone to have their voice in the report so that when we present this to the legislature, we can say, okay, these stakeholders had reservations because. It will not be a so-and-so voted no, so-and-so voted yes, we move forward with majority. That's not the intention. The reason I've asked Trace to kind of poll for the voting is so that I can note that in the report, because I think it's important, because if those are road bumps or hurdles we're going to hit as we potentially move forward into legislation or other actions, I just want to be very transparent with them. So again, this vote isn't meant to call anyone out. It's really truly so I can properly note it in the report, along with whatever else might need to be included, so we can inform our legislators effectively about what we're working on.
And Jordan, I think one thing that I wasn't, so I appreciate that. Do you prefer bucket by bucket or just one broad?
Yeah. So how I kind of envision right now, what I'm going to take a swing at writing is each of these buckets in loose recommendation form. Again, we'll note in the report that we're going to continue talking about these and potentially developing them in certain places, but I'd like to go bucket by bucket, take a poll of the group, Are you in agreement that we would like to move forward with this general concept? Is anyone in opposition of moving forward with this action? And then we can go piece by piece.
Cool. Any questions there? Again, a formality, if you will, not my favorite, but we'll do it. Jordan's always like, process trace. I'm like, oh yeah, sure. Okay, so let's do that. And then we will close things out. We're at the 50 and I haven't seen anything for public comment. So if anybody has public comment, please make a note to me in the chat. Otherwise, we will close things up. Let's start with, we'll just do the digital hand. If is everybody able to do a digital hand? Again, this is just for task force members. Okay, so as Jordan said, an agreement that we are kind of moving forward with this bucket as it relates to the intervention side of recommendations. Let's start with the artist formerly known as the absconder unit bucket, I believe recovery unit, some form of that. If you are in support of that and all things that we will continue to iterate on, please raise your digital hand and we'll make note of that. I'm just going to read out loud. I have Kevin, Jenna, Beth, Anna, David, Brian, Renee, Becky, Brandon, Elizabeth, okay. If you can lower your hands.
And then Trace, if I could just take a quick moment for the people who did not vote in favor, I just want to open up the floor to any notes you want in the report about concerns that may be standing.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you want me to vote it as a no and an abstention?
We can definitely do that. Yeah. You
Yeah,
can do
we'll
an
do that.
abstention and then a reason or a no with the reason would be really helpful.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's do no's and then we'll go to abstentions. For the record, anyone on no?
This is Dennis. In the lack of, without a lot more information on what this would look like, I'm a no.
Yep. So right now you're a no, but again, as things continue to build out, the opportunity to revisit, am I reading that right?
Yeah, possibly, yes.
Any other no's or abstentions?
Hey Trace, this is Brandon. I guess I'm more on the side with Dennis too. Like I'm not opposed to it, but I would need a lot more information. So I'm a yes, but I'm also kind of a no. I'm not sold on it 100%.
So Brandon, would you like me to catch that as a no at this time pending further development?
Yeah, probably. That'd probably be good.
And Dennis, would that be appropriate language for you too?
Yes.
This is
That's good.
Elizabeth too. I think the concept sounds really expensive and I think that our dollars could probably be better placed, along the lines of creating these shelter concepts. So I don't know. I'm not necessarily a yes, I guess.
Yeah, and we can, Elizabeth, we can name those pieces too, those questions again as parts of the tension of that bucket. Okay. All right, let's.
I would like, Trace, can I just go on record as agreeing with that as well? Exactly how Elizabeth framed it.
Yeah, absolutely. You're talking about the priorities piece.
Yeah, just concerns about the expenses around it and the details. I do think that in terms of where we, invest our money, that could be not the best place.
Can I make a suggestion that instead of on the funding side, that we make a note of that broadly and that we talk about when we get more towards the end, that we actually talk about prioritization as this group sees fit, instead of kind of picking on one and be like, well, I'm not sure. It's like, generally speaking, this group recognizes that funds are limited and decisions have to be made. And so this is how we see that. So I would put that more on the funding tension than I would like the individual one. Does that make sense? Okay.
So Trace,
I think Becky and Elizabeth's yeah, it's more around the funding piece and how we would prioritize, right?
so
So
Becky and Elizabeth, do you want me to mark you as a no, or do you want me to mark you as a standing yes with concerns? I just want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting your position.
Elizabeth, you're on mute.
Probably a no at this point.
Okay, that's totally, thank you.
Thank you.
Becky.
I think I'm a yes with concerns.
Okay. And we'll capture that. Renee?
Yeah, I guess with the discussion, I'm getting less clear about what we are voting for. And I guess what I was thinking of, this idea for the recovery unit, it hasn't been fleshed out in terms of is this largely around communication? Is it boots on the ground? Certainly there's the ideal if we had unlimited money and how that might look, et cetera. And so, I guess I thought the vote was more around, is this an idea to pursue?
Yeah, and that's right, Renee.
That is what we're voting on. Yep.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, we definitely know that this is not fully fleshed out, but again, we've got a report to get to. So it's more like, what is the momentum around the conversations? And we know that. So Renee, you're right, that what we are voting on, sorry if that wasn't clear. What we are voting on is that we are continuing the conversation. Like we still have another year of this work, right? So is this fully fleshed out? No. Beyond a year, actually. So we will get into the nitty gritty there, but we do have to kind of make sure that we're shaping it in the way that folks are in agreement with.
So the vote then essentially that whether we think it should be a conversation to continue, that it's an element.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Doris, am I butchering it? Is that okay? It's a challenging, you kind of like, people are like, wait a minute, is this the final thing? It's like, no, it's not the final thing. It's the challenge of an interim report of like, we got to pause for a second and just note where we are in the process. So, all right, let's move on to the next, the standardized policy response. I don't know if we're calling it a manual. Is that standardized policy response need? Please raise your hand if you are a yes.
Sorry, Teresa, I missed this. What's this vote on?
This is the standardized policy response.
And this
So create,
vote, hand up is for a yes.
yeah, hand up is for a yes. And Dennis, I had yours up. Is it, I don't know if you lowered it. Okay. All right. So I'm going to read out loud. I've got Jenna, Beth, Brian, Renee, Becky, Anna, Elizabeth, Kevin, Brandon, and Dennis. Any no or abstentions? Okay. Again, we'll revisit, of course, and continue the conversation around the how and the what. All right. And the last piece is the intermediate placements when kids are recovered. Please raise your hand as a yes. I'll read out loud. Kevin, Brandon, Beth, Jenna, Elizabeth, Becky, Brian, Anna, and Renee. If you could lower your hands. And then any no or abstentions.
This is Dennis. I'm an abstention just because it would be my job to implement. So I think I should just be neutral.
Yeah. Appreciate that, Dennis. I think that's right. And that's totally fair.
And I'm so sorry. I'm just not sure if Chelsea's hearing us. I just haven't seen Chelsea go up or down either way yet.
I think for the sake of time, or go ahead, sorry.
No, sorry, I'm hearing you. I guess I wasn't sure we got into my group yet. Or what was supposed to vote for all the groups. I guess I was confused.
Oh, we were voting on each one. Chelsea, I think for purposes of time, we can follow up and make sure we capture your vote accordingly.
Okay,
Uh,
sorry. I thought I was supposed to vote for my group. That's the part I missed.
No, you're fine. You're fine. You're fine. I will follow up with you separately just to make sure we capture that, but I want to make sure we honor folks' time. All right. So, thank you all again. We know this is a perfectly imperfect process and appreciate you doing the work with us. Excited to continue the conversations and excited to come back to you at the next meeting with something for you all to respond to and ensure that we're kind of on the right path. But again, lots and lots of work ahead of us over the next year plus. So thank you for being in this with us. And I'm going to drop into the chat a quick survey. Again, we really appreciate your feedback, your ideas, your thoughts, your concerns, etc. So please just take a minute, if you wouldn't mind, to do that for us. And we will see you. What's our next date? I don't have it in front of me. Jordan, what's our next date? Oh gosh.
September 6th.
Oh, that's right. It's my birthday, September 6th. I look forward to my birthday party on September 6th with each of you.
Our share party.
I love it. I love it. All right, y'all. Well, the survey's in the chat. It's 10:01. I've taken your time. Thank you, and we'll see you in September.